Imagine standing in a treasury so vast that the gold stacked inside could fund entire kingdoms for generations. Now imagine that this wasn't just one treasury, but dozens, scattered across an empire that controlled more wealth than any civilization before it. This wasn't myth. This wasn't exaggeration. This was ancient Egypt at the height of its power. But here's what nobody tells you. Egypt didn't become the richest empire on earth by accident. They didn't stumble into wealth. They engineered it. They weaponized it. And the systems they created were so sophisticated that modern economists still study them today. In the next 30 minutes, you're going to discover the real secret behind Egypt's unimaginable wealth. Not the pyramids, not the pharaohs, but something far more calculated, far more ruthless, and far more brilliant than anything you've been taught in school. This is the story of how ancient Egypt became the richest empire on Earth. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll never look at ancient history the same way again. Let me take you back approximately 5,000 years. The world looked very different then. No cities stretched across horizons. No nations commanded vast territories. And wealth? Wealth was measured in survival, in whether your crops grew, whether your children lived, whether you saw another season. But in one corner of the world, something extraordinary was happening. The Nile River, flowing north through the eastern Sahara, created a phenomenon that would change human civilization forever. Every single year, with astronomical precision, this river would flood. But this wasn't destruction. This was delivery. The Nile carried with it millions of tons of rich black silt from the heart of Africa, depositing this natural fertilizer across the floodplains of Egypt. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, because of this dark, fertile soil. And they called the surrounding desert Deshret, the Red Land. This wasn't just poetic naming. This was the recognition of a geographic miracle. Think about this for a moment. While other ancient civilizations struggled with unpredictable weather, droughts that lasted years, and famines that wiped out entire populations, Egypt had a river that delivered prosperity on schedule. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus would later call Egypt the gift of the Nile. But that phrase doesn't capture the magnitude of what was really happening here. This wasn't just a gift. This was the ancient world's equivalent of printing money. Here's where it gets interesting. The Nile's flooding created something unprecedented in human history. Surplus. Massive, consistent, predictable surplus. Egyptian farmers could grow 2, sometimes 3 crops per year in the same field. Let me put that in perspective. While farmers in Mesopotamia, Greece, or early Rome were struggling to feed their own families with single annual harvests, Egyptian agriculture was producing enough food to feed not just farmers, but massive populations of non-farmers. And this is the key that unlocked everything else. See, in most ancient societies, nearly everyone had to farm just to survive. But in Egypt, recent archaeological evidence suggests that as early as the Old Kingdom period, that's around 2700 BCE, only about 60 to 70% of the population needed to be involved in food production. That might not sound revolutionary until you realize what it meant. It meant that 30 to 40% of Egypt's population was free to do other things. to become craftsmen, scribes, priests, artists, soldiers, administrators, engineers. This wasn't just economic surplus, this was human capital surplus, and the pharaohs understood exactly how to exploit it. Now, most documentaries will tell you that Egypt's wealth came from gold mines and trade routes. And yes, those mattered. We'll get to that. But the real foundation of Egyptian wealth was something far more mundane and far more brilliant: taxation. But forget everything you think you know about ancient taxes. The Egyptian system was sophisticated in ways that would make modern governments jealous. Every single year, during a period called the Nile Rising, royal officials would travel throughout Egypt conducting what they called the numbering. They counted livestock, they measured land, they assessed crop yields. They recorded everything in meticulous detail on papyrus scrolls that were stored in regional administrative centers. And here's the genius part. Egyptian taxes weren't collected in money, because for most of Egyptian history, they didn't really use money as we understand it. Instead, they collected taxes in kind, in grain, in livestock, in labor, in goods. The government became the central hub of the entire Egyptian economy. Farmers paid their taxes in grain, which was stored in massive government granaries. These weren't small structures. We're talking about facilities that could store hundreds of thousands of bushels of grain. Some granaries in ancient Thebes were larger than modern warehouse distribution centers. The government then used this stored wealth to pay everyone else. Workers on construction projects received grain rations. Soldiers received grain rations. Priests received grain rations. Government officials received grain rations. Egypt essentially created one of the world's first centrally planned economies, and it worked with shocking efficiency for over 3,000 years. But grain storage alone doesn't build pyramids. It doesn't construct massive temples. It doesn't create an empire. For that, you need labor. Massive amounts of organized labor. And this is where we need to bust one of history's most persistent myths. The pyramids were not built by slaves. Recent archaeological evidence from workers' villages near the pyramids has proven this conclusively. These were paid laborers, fed from government granaries, working in organized shifts. But here's what's even more interesting. During the Nile's flood season, typically lasting about 4 months, Egyptian farmers couldn't work their fields anyway. The land was underwater, so the government implemented a system of seasonal corvée labor. Farmers would report to government projects during the flood season, where they would be housed, fed, and put to work on massive state projects. This was brilliant for multiple reasons. First, it prevented a class of perpetually idle workers during the off-season. Second, it created a sense of national participation and pride. Every farmer could say they helped build a pyramid or temple. Third, it gave the government access to tens of thousands of workers without maintaining a permanent labor force year-round. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid was built, claimed it took 100,000 men 20 years to construct. Modern estimates suggest numbers closer to 20 to 30,000 workers at any given time, working in 3-month shifts. That's still an organizational achievement that wouldn't be matched in scale until the Roman Empire. But moving grain and organizing labor is only part of the story. For Egypt to truly leverage its geographic advantages, it needed infrastructure, and lots of it. The Nile flows north, which meant that sailing downstream toward the Mediterranean required no wind. You just went with the current. But Egypt's prevailing winds blow from north to south, which meant that sailing upstream against the current was actually easier than sailing downstream in many other river systems. This created a natural two-way transportation highway. The ancient Egyptians exploited this ruthlessly. They built massive fleets of cargo vessels. Archaeological excavations have uncovered harbors, docking facilities, and canal systems far more extensive than previously imagined. In 2021, archaeologists discovered a 3,000-year-old canal system near the modern city of Luxor that could accommodate ships carrying over 70 tons of cargo. 70 tons. Let that sink in. That's like moving a fully loaded modern semi-truck by boat 3,000 years ago. They didn't stop at the Nile. Evidence suggests that as early as the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, Egyptian engineers were constructing canals to connect the Nile to the Red Sea, creating a trade route to East Africa and beyond. The scale of engineering required for this is staggering. We're talking about moving millions of cubic meters of earth with nothing but human labor, copper tools, and organizational genius. This infrastructure transformed Egypt from a geographically fortunate region into an economic superpower. Goods could move from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt in days rather than weeks. Resources could be redistributed according to need. The government could respond to regional famines or surpluses with unprecedented speed. Egypt didn't just have wealth, it had liquidity, it had economic flexibility, and in the ancient world, that was just as valuable as gold. Now we get to the part everyone thinks they know about: the gold. But trust me, the real story is far more interesting than Egypt had gold mines. The Eastern Desert, that vast hostile expanse between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea, held one of the ancient world's greatest treasures. Not in terms of tombs or monuments, but in terms of raw geological wealth. This region contained some of the most productive gold deposits accessible to ancient mining technology. But here's what makes this remarkable. Mining gold in the Eastern Desert wasn't just difficult, it was deadly. We're talking about an environment where summer temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius. That's 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Where water sources are separated by days of travel. Where the terrain is so rugged that modern four-wheel drive vehicles struggle to navigate it. The ancient Egyptians not only mined gold here, they did it on an industrial scale for over 2,000 years. Recent archaeological surveys using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have identified over 1,300 ancient mining sites in Egypt's Eastern Desert. 1,300. We're not talking about guys with pickaxes finding nuggets in streams. We're talking about sophisticated mining operations with infrastructure, planning, and logistics that would impress modern mining companies. Let me walk you through how this actually worked, because the ingenuity involved is absolutely staggering. First, Egyptian prospectors, experienced miners who understood geology in ways we're only beginning to appreciate, would survey the desert looking for quartz veins. Gold in this region typically appears in quartz deposits, visible as glittering seams in the rock face. Once identified, workers would light fires against the rock face, heating it to extreme temperatures. Then they would douse the heated rock with water, causing thermal shock that fractured the stone. This fire-setting technique allowed them to break through rock that their copper and bronze tools couldn't otherwise penetrate. After breaking the rock, workers would extract the ore and transport it to processing facilities. And this is where it gets really interesting. In 2014, archaeologists excavated a gold processing site in the eastern desert, dating to around 1300 BCE. What they found revolutionized our understanding of ancient Egyptian metallurgy. These weren't primitive operations. These were sophisticated facilities with multiple stages of ore processing. Workers would crush the ore using stone hammers and grinding equipment. Then they would wash the crushed ore in water, separating the heavier gold particles from lighter waste rock through a process called gravity separation. But the Egyptians didn't stop there. They developed a technique for extracting gold from ore that wouldn't be improved upon until the development of mercury amalgamation thousands of years later. They would mix crushed ore with salt, creating a chemical reaction that separated gold from surrounding minerals more effectively than simple washing. The efficiency of this process was remarkable. Modern analysis of slag heaps, waste rock from ancient mining operations, shows that Egyptian miners were extracting up to 90% of available gold from their ore. 90%. That's comparable to modern industrial mining operations. But this industrial efficiency came at a horrific price. Ancient sources, particularly from the Greek geographer Archaeology, describe conditions in Egyptian gold mines that can only be described as hell on earth. Unlike the pyramid builders, mine workers were often criminals, prisoners of war, and enslaved peoples subjected to conditions designed to extract maximum labor before inevitable death. Archaeology wrote that miners worked in chains, in complete darkness except for lamps attached to their foreheads, breathing air thick with rock dust that destroyed their lungs. Children were sent into the smallest passages where adults couldn't fit. Life expectancy for mine workers was measured in months, not years. Now, some historians debate the accuracy of Archaeology's accounts, arguing he was writing centuries after the height of Egyptian mining operations and may have exaggerated conditions. But archaeological evidence supports at least the general picture. Skeletal remains found near mining sites show signs of severe physical trauma, malnutrition, and respiratory diseases consistent with prolonged exposure to rock dust. The wealth of Egypt, the gold that impressed foreign kings, that financed armies, that decorated temples, was built on suffering of unimaginable scale. This is the dark side of ancient wealth that we often sanitize in documentaries and textbooks. So, how much gold are we actually talking about? This is where things get truly mind-blowing. Conservative estimates suggest that over Egypt's 3,000-year history as a unified kingdom, Egyptian mines produced somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 tons of gold. That's 3 to 5 million kilograms. At current gold prices, around $60,000 per kilogram, We're talking about roughly $200 to $300 billion worth of gold. But that calculation is meaningless, because gold in the ancient world wasn't valued at market rates. It was valued at scarcity rates. In the Bronze Age, gold was so rare that possessing even small amounts was a sign of tremendous wealth. The Egyptian monopoly on large-scale gold production made them, quite literally, richer than every other kingdom combined. We have records of foreign kings, powerful rulers of major kingdoms, essentially begging Egyptian pharaohs for gold. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence from around 1350 BCE, contain numerous letters from Babylonian, Mitanni, and Assyrian kings asking the pharaoh for gold, often in increasingly desperate terms. One letter from the Babylonian king Kadashman-Enlil I to Pharaoh Amenhotep III literally says, "Send me gold in very great quantity without measure, for in my brother's land gold is as common as dust." This is a king of Babylon, one of the richest kingdoms in Mesopotamia, telling the pharaoh that in Egypt gold is as common as dirt. Think about the economic power that represents. The pharaoh controlled a resource that every other major power desperately wanted, in quantities that no one else could match. That's not just wealth, that's geopolitical leverage. And Egypt weaponized this leverage brilliantly. Gold became Egypt's diplomatic currency. When the pharaoh wanted to secure an alliance, he sent gold. When he wanted to intimidate a rival, he flaunted his gold wealth. When he wanted to ensure loyalty from regional governors, he distributed gold. More significantly, Egypt established what was effectively the ancient world's first gold standard. Egyptian gold became the benchmark against which other forms of wealth were measured. Trade agreements specified values in terms of daben of gold, a daben being approximately 91 grams. This created a standardized economic system that facilitated trade across vast distances. Archaeological evidence shows Egyptian gold circulating as far as Afghanistan to the east and Spain to the west. This wasn't just trade. This was the creation of an economic sphere of influence. Places that used Egyptian gold as currency became, in effect, tied to Egyptian economic policy. The genius of this system was that it allowed Egypt to exert power without military conquest. Why invade a kingdom when you can control it economically? Why maintain expensive garrisons when economic dependency achieves the same result? But Egypt's gold wealth wasn't just about extraction, it was about presentation. The pharaohs understood something fundamental about wealth. It's not just about having it, it's about making sure everyone knows you have it. And they were absolute masters of this principle. Gold adorned everything. Temple walls were covered with gold leaf. Statues were gilded. Ceremonial furniture was overlaid with gold. Even ordinary administrative documents sometimes used ink containing gold dust for particularly important passages. But the real masterpiece of Egyptian gold propaganda was the pharaoh himself. Ancient texts describe pharaohs processing through crowds while gold was literally thrown to the people, a practice called rewarding with gold. Imagine the psychological impact. The pharaoh is so wealthy that he can literally throw money to crowds, and it doesn't diminish his wealth in any meaningful way. This wasn't wasteful. This was strategic. Every person who caught a piece of pharaonic gold became a walking advertisement for Egyptian wealth. Every foreign dignitary who witnessed these displays returned home with stories that enhanced Egypt's reputation. The Romans, over 1,000 years later, would adopt similar practices with their triumph parades. But the Egyptians perfected this art of visible wealth as power projection centuries earlier. Egypt's geographic position gave it more than agricultural advantages. Look at a map of the ancient world, and you'll see something remarkable. Egypt sits at the junction of 3 continents: Africa to the south, Asia to the east, Europe across the Mediterranean to the north. This wasn't just convenient. This was the ancient equivalent of controlling a major international airport, seaport, and railroad hub all in one location. And the Egyptians understood exactly how to monetize this position. Let's start with one of ancient Egypt's most famous trade relationships, the legendary Land of Punt. Punt, most likely located in modern-day Somalia, Eritrea, or Yemen, though scholars still debate this, represented the source of luxury goods that Egyptian elites craved. We're talking about frankincense, myrrh, ebony, ivory, exotic animals, and gold from sub-Saharan Africa. But here's what's remarkable. Expeditions to Punt weren't casual trading missions. These were massive state-sponsored expeditions involving hundreds of people, dozens of ships, and years of preparation. The most famous Punt expedition we know about was commissioned by Queen Hatshepsut around 1470 BCE. The entire expedition is documented in incredible detail on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. And I mean incredible detail. We can see what the ships looked like, what goods were traded, even what the king and queen of Punt looked like. The expedition returned with ships loaded with 31 live frankincense trees, along with massive quantities of myrrh resin, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals, including leopards, baboons, and giraffes. The economic value of a single Punt expedition could fund government operations for years. But here's what most people miss. These expeditions weren't just about acquiring luxury goods. They were about controlling the distribution of those goods throughout the ancient world. See, frankincense and myrrh were essential for ancient religious ceremonies throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. Temples needed them for incense. Embalmers needed them for mummification. Wealthy households burned them as status symbols. The demand was constant and insatiable. And Egypt controlled the supply. You wanted frankincense? You either traveled to Punt yourself, a journey that would take years and had a high chance of killing everyone involved, or you bought it from Egypt at whatever price Egypt decided to charge. This is economic monopoly at its finest. Egypt didn't just trade goods, they controlled access to goods that entire economies depended on. Now look north. The city of Byblos in modern-day Lebanon maintained trade relations with Egypt for literally thousands of years. We have archaeological evidence of Egyptian Byblos trade dating back to at least 3000 BCE and continuing well into the first millennium BCE. What made Byblos so valuable? Cedar wood. This might not sound exciting until you realize that Egypt had virtually no trees suitable for construction. The trees that grew along the Nile, palm trees, acacia, sycamore fig, were great for many purposes, but terrible for building ships, constructing building frameworks, or creating the massive doors required for temples and palaces. Cedar from Lebanon was straight-grained, resistant to insects and rot, and could be grown to enormous sizes. Lebanese cedar beams 50 to 60 feet long were not uncommon. This was premium construction material. But importing timber from Lebanon wasn't cheap. And here's where Egyptian economic power really shows itself. We have records of the pharaohs essentially buying exclusive access to Lebanese cedar forests. They would send massive amounts of gold, grain, and manufactured goods to Byblos. And in return, Egyptian merchants got preferential access to the best timber. This created an economic relationship so deep that Byblos essentially became an Egyptian client state. The city's rulers took Egyptian names. They adopted Egyptian religious practices. They styled themselves as Egyptian nobles. Byblos maintained political independence, but economically, they were tied to Egypt in ways that made that independence largely theoretical. And this wasn't limited to Byblos. Egyptian trade goods, particularly grain during famines, gave the pharaohs influence over Phoenician cities up and down the Mediterranean coast. Egypt didn't need to conquer these cities militarily. Economic dependence achieved the same result with a fraction of the cost. Now let's go south, into Nubia, the region that is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan. This is where things get complicated, because Egypt's relationship with Nubia was neither pure conquest nor pure trade. It was something more fluid and complex. Nubia sat atop some of the richest gold deposits in the ancient world. The name Nubia likely derives from Nub, the Egyptian word for gold. That's how closely associated the region was with gold wealth. For most of Egyptian history, the pharaohs maintained a complicated relationship with Nubian kingdoms. Sometimes Egypt conquered and directly controlled Nubian territory. Sometimes they established tribute relationships where Nubian rulers remained in power but paid gold to Egypt. Sometimes they were equal trading partners. But here's what remained constant: Egyptian access to Nubian gold. Recent archaeological work in Nubia has revealed the scale of ancient gold mining there. We're talking about thousands of mining sites, some of which operated continuously for centuries. The Wadi al-Arqi region alone, just one gold-bearing area in Nubia, contains evidence of over 400 ancient mining operations. During the New Kingdom period, particularly under pharaohs like Thutmose III and Rameses II, Egypt established a colonial administration in Nubia specifically designed to extract maximum gold wealth. The Viceroy of Kush, basically the colonial governor of Nubia, had one primary job: keep the gold flowing north. And flow it did. Inscriptions from this period record tribute payments from Nubia that are almost incomprehensible in scale. One inscription from the reign of Thutmose III records a single tribute payment of 434 pounds of gold rings, plus an unspecified amount of gold dust. That's just one payment from 1 year. Multiply that across decades, across multiple regions, and you start to understand the staggering wealth flowing into Egyptian treasuries. But Egypt's trade network extended far beyond African and Near Eastern shores. Archaeological evidence shows Egyptian goods reaching Minoan Crete, Mycenaean Greece, the Italian peninsula, and even as far as the British Isles. Egyptian faience beads, beautiful blue-glazed ceramic beads, have been found in Bronze Age sites across Europe. These weren't just random trade goods. Faience production required specialized knowledge and access to materials that most ancient societies didn't have. Egyptian faience beads became status symbols, traded at premiums far exceeding their material cost. In exchange, Egypt received copper from Cyprus, silver from Anatolia, tin from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli from modern-day Afghanistan, and olive oil from Greece. But here's the key. Egypt was always trading from a position of strength. They had the gold. They had the grain. They had the geographic position. When other kingdoms needed resources, they came to Egypt. When Egypt needed resources, they could demand favorable terms because everyone knew the pharaoh's treasuries could outlast any negotiation. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Egyptian trade was how it was organized. This wasn't free market capitalism. This was state-controlled trade at a level that would make modern command economies look amateur. All foreign trade went through government-controlled channels. Merchants didn't privately negotiate deals with foreign kingdoms. They operated with royal charters, essentially as government contractors. The state set prices, controlled quality, and determined what goods could be traded. This gave the pharaoh's government several advantages. First, it ensured that trade agreements served state interests rather than private profit. Second, it allowed the government to take a cut of every transaction through fees and tariffs. Third, it prevented individual merchants from accumulating enough wealth to challenge royal authority. We have papyrus records showing how this system worked in practice. Government officials would register all imported goods, assess their value, take a percentage as tariff, and then authorize sale or distribution. Goods destined for government use, and that was most luxury items, went directly into royal warehouses without ever entering private commerce. This centralized control meant that Egypt could manipulate trade in ways that served strategic goals. Need to pressure a foreign kingdom? Cut off grain exports? Want to reward a loyal ally? Grant favorable trade terms. This was economic warfare and diplomacy operating at a level of sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until the Roman Empire. But here's something that often gets overlooked. Egyptian trade dominance wasn't just about goods. It was about information. Think about it. Egyptian merchants traveled from Nubia to Byblos, from Punt to Crete, from Mesopotamia to the Western Mediterranean. They spoke multiple languages. They observed foreign kingdoms' strengths and weaknesses. They reported back to Egyptian administrators. Egypt's trade network was also an intelligence network. The pharaoh's government knew which kingdoms were experiencing famine before their own populations did. They knew which rulers were facing internal rebellions. They knew where military buildups were occurring. This information advantage allowed Egypt to make strategic decisions with far more complete information than their rivals. They could time trade missions to arrive when foreign kingdoms were most desperate and most willing to accept unfavorable terms. They could identify opportunities for alliance or exploitation before opportunities became obvious. In the ancient world, where information traveled at the speed of a ship or a walking messenger, having an information advantage of even weeks or months could be decisive. Egypt's trade network gave them an information advantage measured in seasons or years. This is something we often miss when we look at ancient economic systems. We focus on gold and grain and trade goods. But the real wealth, the sustainable wealth, came from systemic advantages: geographic position, information networks, control of critical resources, institutional knowledge. Egypt didn't just have more wealth than other kingdoms. They had better systems for generating, maintaining, and deploying wealth. And those systems lasted not for decades or centuries, but for millennia. Here's where the story gets darker and more complex. Because all the gold, all the grain, all the trade networks in the world don't matter if you can't defend them. And Egypt, for most of its history, didn't just defend its wealth. It used wealth as a weapon of war. The relationship between Egyptian wealth and Egyptian military power is one of the most fascinating and brutal aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization. This wasn't just about having money to buy weapons. This was about creating a military economic complex that would fund and sustain Egyptian dominance for over 1,000 years. Let's go back to around 1550 BCE, during what Egyptologists call the Second Intermediate Period. Egypt had been humiliated. For over 100 years, foreign rulers called the Hyksos had controlled northern Egypt. These weren't Egyptian pharaohs. These were Asiatic rulers who had conquered Egyptian territory through superior military technology, particularly the horse-drawn chariot and composite bow. The Hyksos period traumatized Egyptian civilization. For centuries, Egypt had seen itself as the center of the world, protected by desert barriers and Nile geography. The idea that foreigners could not just invade, but actually conquer and rule Egypt shattered that worldview. When Egyptian rulers finally drove out the Hyksos, around 1550 BCE, they learned a critical lesson. Wealth means nothing if you can't defend it. And defense required a professional, standing military force. Prior to this, Egyptian armies had been mostly conscript forces. Farmers called up during the off-season to fight in campaigns that lasted weeks or months before everyone went home for harvest. This worked fine for defensive operations or small-scale raids, but it was woefully inadequate for sustained military campaigns. So the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, starting with Ahmose I and continuing through rulers like Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and Rameses II, created something revolutionary. A permanent professional military funded by state wealth. And this wasn't cheap. A professional soldier had to be paid year-round, whether he was fighting or not. He needed equipment, bronze weapons, leather armor, shields, chariots. He needed training. He needed officers. He needed support staff, quartermasters, scribes, medics, craftsmen to repair equipment. A single Egyptian chariot, the ancient world's equivalent of a main battle tank, cost roughly as much as a small farm. It required a specially bred horse team, a driver, an archer, bronze fittings, leather harnesses, and constant maintenance. An elite chariot corps of 1,000 vehicles represented an investment equivalent to thousands of acres of productive farmland. But Egypt could afford it. The gold from Nubia and the eastern desert, combined with agricultural surplus from the Nile, created a revenue stream that could sustain military spending at levels no other Bronze Age kingdom could match. Here's where Egyptian military strategy became truly sophisticated. The pharaohs didn't just build an army to defend Egypt. They built an army to generate wealth. Let me explain. Every successful military campaign generated booty, gold, silver, livestock, slaves, luxury goods. Egyptian army records meticulously document what was captured during campaigns, and these numbers are staggering. A single inscription from the reign of Thutmose III, documenting his campaign in Syria and Palestine, lists captured booty including 2,041 horses, 191 foals, 6 stallions, 924 chariots, 200 suits of armor, 502 bows, 1,929 cattle, 2,000 goats, and 20,500 sheep, plus an unspecified amount of gold, silver, and other precious metals. That's from one campaign. Thutmose III conducted 17 major military campaigns during his reign. Even accounting for ancient exaggeration and Egyptian military inscriptions definitely inflated numbers, we're still talking about wealth extraction on an industrial scale. But the real genius was what happened to this wealth. It didn't disappear into royal treasuries, never to be seen again. It cycled back into the economy in ways that generated even more wealth. Captured horses went to chariot corps, increasing military strength. Captured livestock went to temple estates, which fed priests and temple workers. Captured precious metals were distributed as rewards to successful soldiers and officers, creating an incentive system that encouraged loyalty and valor. Captured people, and yes, Egypt absolutely practiced slavery, were put to work on construction projects, in mines, or on agricultural estates. The military essentially became a wealth-generating machine. Each successful campaign brought in resources that could fund the next campaign. And because the military was professionally trained and well-equipped, it was successful far more often than not. This created a feedback loop. Military strength generated wealth. Wealth funded military strength. Military strength generated more wealth. For over 400 years during the New Kingdom period, this system worked with terrifying efficiency. But direct conquest and plunder wasn't Egypt's only military economic strategy. The pharaohs also pioneered something that would later be perfected by the Romans and the British Empire: the tribute system. Rather than directly conquering and administering foreign territories, which was expensive and risky, Egypt often established tributary relationships with surrounding kingdoms. These kingdoms remained politically independent, with their own rulers and internal governance. But they paid annual tribute to Egypt. The Amarna letters provide incredible detail about how this system worked. We have letters from rulers of Canaanite city-states, small kingdoms in Syria and Palestine, all addressing the pharaoh as their overlord and promising tribute payments. But here's the clever part. The tribute wasn't just a payment. It was protection money. Egypt maintained military garrisons at strategic locations throughout the region. If you paid tribute, Egyptian forces would protect you from bandits, raiders, and rival kingdoms. If you didn't pay tribute, Egyptian forces would become your problem instead. This was the ancient version of a protection racket, operating at a geopolitical level. And it was incredibly profitable. Tribute payments from multiple small kingdoms added up to revenue streams that rivaled the wealth from direct mining and agriculture. Even better, from Egypt's perspective, this system required relatively few Egyptian soldiers and administrators. The tributary kingdoms essentially governed themselves and paid for the privilege of doing so. Egypt got the wealth without the overhead costs of direct administration. But let's dig deeper into the actual economics of ancient warfare, because this is where things get really interesting. A military campaign wasn't just expensive. It was an investment. And like any investment, it needed to generate returns. Consider the logistics. Moving an army of 10,000 soldiers through enemy territory required massive amounts of food, water, and supplies. You needed pack animals, donkeys, oxen to carry equipment. You needed scouts. You needed translators. You needed months or even years of preparation. Egyptian records suggest that a major military campaign could cost the equivalent of several years of normal tax revenue just to organize and execute. That's a huge investment. If the campaign failed, if the army was defeated or came back empty-handed, it would be a financial disaster that could destabilize the entire kingdom. But if it succeeded, the returns could be extraordinary. Capturing a wealthy city could bring in enough gold, silver, and trade goods to pay for the entire campaign many times over. Establishing tribute relationships could generate revenue for generations. Capturing slaves could provide labor for construction projects that would otherwise require hiring expensive workers. The pharaohs essentially operated as venture capitalists of warfare. They invested enormous sums in military campaigns with the expectation of generating returns that would justify the risk. And the accounting was meticulous. We have papyrus records showing exactly how captured booty was divided. The pharaoh took the lion's share, typically around half. The remainder was distributed to military commanders, soldiers, temples, and government officials according to complex formulas that rewarded success and incentivized loyalty. This wasn't just military conquest. This was military conquest as an economic enterprise. But Egypt's warfare economy wasn't just about what happened on the battlefield. It was also about what happened in workshops and arsenals back home. Egyptian military equipment production represented one of the ancient world's first true industrial sectors. We're talking about specialized facilities dedicated to mass-producing weapons, armor, chariots, and other military equipment at scales that required coordination between multiple production centers. Bronze weapons require copper and tin. Egypt had copper from Sinai, but tin had to be imported from as far away as Afghanistan. The logistics of gathering these materials, transporting them to production centers, smelting them in the correct ratios, casting them into weapon molds, grinding and polishing the finished products, and then distributing them to military units. All of this required sophisticated supply chain management, and it employed thousands of people: miners to extract copper, merchants to import tin, smelter workers to produce bronze, craftsmen to cast weapons, artisans to make leather armor and wooden shields, carpenters to build chariots, animal breeders to produce war horses. This military-industrial sector pumped wealth into the Egyptian economy. The workers in these facilities were paid from government funds, which meant gold and grain flowing from royal treasuries into the broader economy, where it could be spent on food, housing, and consumer goods. Modern economists call this the multiplier effect, when government spending creates economic activity that generates additional economic activity. Ancient Egypt didn't have this terminology, but they understood the principle. Military spending wasn't just preparation for war, it was economic stimulus. But here's where we need to be honest about the dark side of all this. The Egyptian military economic system was built on violence, exploitation, and suffering. The wealth generated through military campaigns came from destroying other people's cities, killing their soldiers, enslaving their populations, and stealing their resources. The tribute system, for all its economic efficiency, was enforced through the threat of violence. Kingdoms paid tribute because they feared Egyptian military retaliation if they didn't. The protection offered by Egyptian military forces was protection from those same Egyptian forces. And the costs of military failure were catastrophic. When Egypt lost battles, and it did lose, particularly in the later New Kingdom, the economic consequences were severe. Lost battles meant no booty, which meant no returns on military investments. Worse, military defeats often encouraged tribute-paying kingdoms to rebel, cutting off revenue streams and forcing expensive reconquest campaigns. The Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, the famous clash between Rameses II and the Hittite Empire, exemplifies both the ambitions and the limits of Egyptian military economic policy. The battle ended in a stalemate after Rameses nearly lost his entire army in an ambush. Egypt claimed victory, but the reality was that both empires had to sign a peace treaty because neither could afford to continue fighting. After Kadesh, Egypt's military-economic system began a slow decline. The costs of maintaining a professional army, combined with decreasing returns from military campaigns as rival kingdoms grew stronger, meant that the warfare economy stopped being profitable. By the end of the New Kingdom, around 1070 BCE, Egypt's military power had declined dramatically. The empire that once dominated from Nubia to Syria had shrunk back to Egypt proper. The tribute system collapsed. The military-economic feedback loop that had generated wealth for centuries finally broke down. The lesson here is brutal but important. Wealth generated through violence is inherently unstable. It works as long as you keep winning. But eventually, you face an enemy you can't defeat, or the costs of constant warfare exceed the benefits, or your victims organize effective resistance. Egyptian military economic dominance lasted for about 400 years during the New Kingdom, an impressive run by any standard. But it wasn't sustainable forever. Here's something that almost never gets discussed in documentaries about ancient Egyptian wealth. The most valuable thing Egypt produced wasn't gold, wasn't grain, wasn't even military power. It was knowledge. It was skill. It was institutional expertise that took centuries to develop and couldn't be stolen or conquered. Think about what Egypt could do that other ancient civilizations couldn't. They could build structures that remained standing for thousands of years. They could mummify bodies in ways that preserved them with such effectiveness that we can still study ancient Egyptian remains today in remarkable detail. They could navigate seas using astronomical observations with accuracy that wouldn't be matched until the development of the chronometer 2,000 years later. This expertise didn't emerge overnight. It represented generations of accumulated knowledge, passed down through apprenticeship systems, refined through trial and error, and jealously guarded as state secrets. And it was worth more than gold. Foreign kingdoms would pay enormous sums to acquire Egyptian craftsmen, engineers, and physicians. We have records of Hittite kings requesting Egyptian doctors to treat members of the royal family. We have evidence of Egyptian engineers being sent to other kingdoms to advise on construction projects. We have artifacts showing that Egyptian artistic and architectural styles were copied throughout the Mediterranean world. This was intellectual property before the concept even existed. And Egypt monetized it ruthlessly. At the center of Egyptian knowledge economy was the scribal class. These weren't just record keepers. They were the administrators, accountants, engineers, and managers who made Egyptian civilization function. Becoming a scribe required years of education. Students had to master hieroglyphic writing, hieratic script, mathematics, astronomy, surveying, accounting, and law. The training was rigorous and expensive. Most scribal students came from existing scribal families, creating a hereditary class of educated administrators. But here's why this mattered economically. Egypt's administrative efficiency, its ability to collect taxes, manage granaries, organize labor, and coordinate construction projects, depended entirely on the scribal system. Without scribes, the entire economic machine that generated Egyptian wealth would collapse. The pharaohs understood this. Scribes received generous compensation, high social status, and exemptions from manual labor. Being a scribe was one of the few ways someone from a non-royal background could achieve significant wealth and influence. And this created a positive feedback loop. Talented individuals had strong incentives to become scribes. The scribal class maintained high standards of training and competence. The quality of Egyptian administration remained high, which supported economic efficiency, which generated wealth that could support a large scribal class. Ancient texts literally advertise the scribal profession. One text called The Satire of the Trades describes various professions: farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, in increasingly miserable terms, then concludes by praising the scribal profession as the best of all possible careers. This wasn't just propaganda. This was recruitment marketing for the administrative class that held Egyptian civilization together. Egyptian medicine was the most advanced in the ancient world, and it wasn't particularly close. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text from around 1600 BCE, describes surgical procedures, treatment protocols, and diagnostic techniques that wouldn't be matched in many parts of the world for over 2,000 years. Egyptian physicians understood anatomy with remarkable accuracy thanks to mummification practices. They could perform sophisticated surgeries, including trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure from head injuries. They had effective treatments for infections, broken bones, and various diseases. And this knowledge made Egyptian physicians the most sought-after medical professionals in the ancient world. Greek historians record that Persian kings employed Egyptian physicians. Roman sources mention Egyptian medical expertise with reverence. Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, over 1,000 years after the height of Egyptian medical practice, still referred to ancient Egyptian medical texts as authoritative sources. But Egyptian medical knowledge wasn't freely shared. It was guarded, controlled, and monetized. Foreign rulers who wanted access to Egyptian medical expertise had to negotiate with the pharaoh. Egyptian physicians working abroad were essentially government employees on loan, expected to serve Egyptian interests while treating foreign patients. This created an economic asset that generated value without depleting. Unlike gold mines that eventually run empty, or agricultural land that can be conquered, knowledge-based wealth is infinitely renewable. Teaching medical knowledge to one physician doesn't reduce the knowledge of another. But controlling who has access to that knowledge creates artificial scarcity that can be exploited economically. But here's where things get complicated. As Egyptian civilization aged, knowledge started leaking out. Conquered peoples learned Egyptian techniques. Foreign students studied in Egypt and returned home with knowledge. Egyptian craftsmen working abroad trained local apprentices. By the late period, roughly 700 BCE onward, Egypt no longer had the monopoly on advanced techniques that it had enjoyed during earlier periods. Greek, Phoenician, and Persian civilizations had developed their own expertise, sometimes surpassing Egyptian capabilities in specific areas. This technology transfer represented a massive, largely invisible transfer of wealth. The knowledge that Egypt had spent centuries developing was now available to rivals and competitors. And unlike physical wealth, once knowledge escapes, you can't get it back. This is one of the paradoxes of knowledge-based wealth. It's incredibly valuable and difficult to develop. But once developed, it's very difficult to maintain exclusive control over. Modern economic concepts like patents and intellectual property rights exist precisely to address this problem. Ancient Egypt had no such legal frameworks. The result was that Egyptian expertise, once a major economic advantage, gradually became merely one source of knowledge among many. By the Hellenistic period, after Alexander's conquest, Greek scholars would study in Alexandria and then spread that knowledge throughout the Mediterranean world, with no particular benefit to Egypt itself. So what happened? How did an empire that controlled more wealth than any civilization in history eventually fall? The answer is more complex than most simple narratives suggest. Egypt didn't collapse suddenly. It declined gradually over centuries, eventually losing its independence to a succession of foreign conquerors, Persians, Greeks, Romans. But the seeds of that decline were planted during Egypt's wealthiest periods. Success created complacency. The assumption that gold mines would always produce, that the Nile would always flood, that Egypt's natural advantages were permanent. These assumptions made it difficult for Egyptian civilization to adapt when circumstances changed. Climate change, gradual shifts in rainfall patterns affecting the Nile's flood cycles, reduced agricultural productivity. The rise of iron technology undermined Egypt's bronze-based military advantage. The emergence of new trade routes, particularly maritime routes that bypassed Egypt entirely, reduced Egypt's geographic advantages. Most significantly, Egypt's wealth made it a target. Every ambitious empire that rose in the ancient world eventually looked at Egypt and saw riches worth conquering. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, all of them invaded Egypt, and all of them were motivated in large part by Egyptian wealth. The irony is that Egypt's wealth, which had been the source of its power, eventually became the reason for its defeat. A poorer Egypt might have been ignored by ambitious conquerors, but wealthy Egypt was too tempting a target to resist. But this isn't just ancient history. The patterns that made Egypt wealthy and eventually led to its decline are still relevant today. Control of critical resources matters. Whether it's gold in the ancient world or oil in the modern world, societies that control resources everyone needs have enormous economic and political leverage. Infrastructure investment creates multiplicative returns. Egypt's investment in irrigation, canals, granaries, and transportation infrastructure didn't just facilitate existing economic activity, it created new economic possibilities. Knowledge and expertise are forms of wealth that appreciate rather than depreciate. Egypt's scribal system, medical knowledge, and engineering expertise generated value for centuries and continue to influence other civilizations long after Egypt itself had lost political independence. But wealth without adaptation is fragile. Egypt's decline wasn't inevitable. It resulted from an inability to adapt to changing circumstances. The systems that generated wealth in 2000 BCE didn't work as well in 500 BCE. The failure to evolve those systems meant that accumulated wealth couldn't prevent eventual decline. Military power can generate wealth, but only temporarily. Egypt's New Kingdom military campaigns were profitable for about 4 centuries. That's impressive, but ultimately unsustainable. Wealth built on violence is inherently unstable. Economic complexity is double-edged. Egypt's sophisticated economic systems, the centralized administration, the tribute networks, the trade monopolies, generated enormous wealth. But they also created vulnerabilities. When those systems broke down, the decline was rapid and severe. So how rich was ancient Egypt really? If we tried to calculate Egypt's GDP at its height during the New Kingdom period, around 1400 BCE, we'd be making educated guesses based on incomplete data. But economists who study ancient economies estimate that Egypt's economy might have represented somewhere between 15 and 20% of total global economic output during this period. Think about that. one civilization representing less than 5% of global population controlled nearly 20% of global wealth. That's a level of economic concentration that's almost unprecedented in human history. At its peak, Egypt's annual gold production alone would have been worth billions in modern currency. Add agricultural surplus, trade revenues, and tribute payments, and you're talking about an economic output that would make Egypt one of the wealthiest nations on Earth, even by modern standards. And this was 3,000 years ago. But more important than the raw numbers is what Egypt did with that wealth. They built structures that still stand today. They developed knowledge that influenced human civilization for millennia. They created art and literature that we still study and admire. Ancient Egyptian wealth wasn't just about accumulation. It was about creation. They turned gold into monuments, grain into pyramids, geographic advantages into an empire that lasted longer than any other in human history. But here's the final twist. Despite everything we know about Egyptian wealth, the gold production numbers, the trade records, the tribute accounts, we still don't know where most of it went. Think about this. Egypt produced thousands of tons of gold over 3 millennia, but the total amount of ancient Egyptian gold artifacts that survive today represents only a tiny fraction of that production. Where did it all go? Some was buried with pharaohs and then looted by tomb robbers. Some was melted down and recast by later civilizations. Some might still be hidden in undiscovered tombs or hoards. But most of it simply vanished from the historical record. This is the great unsolved mystery of Egyptian wealth. We know it existed on a massive scale. We have the records. We have the mines. We have the infrastructure. But the physical evidence of that wealth, the actual gold, the actual treasure, largely doesn't exist anymore. Maybe that's fitting. Maybe the real legacy of Egyptian wealth isn't the gold itself, but what the gold made possible. The civilization it built, the knowledge it supported, the monuments it created, or maybe, and this is what keeps Egyptologists awake at night, maybe there are still undiscovered royal treasuries out there. Rooms full of gold, sealed for thousands of years, waiting to be found. Tombs of pharaohs we know existed, but whose burials have never been discovered. The possibility that Egyptian wealth still lies hidden beneath the sand, waiting to rewrite everything we think we know about ancient economics, remains tantalizing. And until every square meter of Egypt has been excavated, something that will never happen, that possibility will remain. Ancient Egypt became the richest empire on Earth through a combination of geographic luck, systematic organization, ruthless exploitation, and sustained innovation over thousands of years. They didn't just accumulate wealth, they created systems for generating, maintaining, and deploying wealth that were more sophisticated than anything that came before. But wealth alone doesn't create greatness. It's what you do with wealth that matters. And Egypt used its wealth to create a civilization so impressive that we're still studying it, still excavating it, still trying to understand it 3,000 years after its decline. That's the real measure of Egyptian wealth. Not the gold they mined or the grain they stored, but the legacy they created. A legacy that influences art, architecture, medicine, engineering, and governance to this day. Ancient Egypt didn't just become rich, they became eternal. And in the end, that's worth more than all the gold in their mines.